Welcome to today's deep dive, where we'll be exploring James Madison's presidency, specifically the War of 1812.
Oh, a fascinating period for sure.
We'll be drawing from excerpts of an American History Hit podcast episode with Kevin R. Goodman, who's a constitutional scholar.
Great source.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking burning buildings, a first lady making a daring escape, and a war that almost bankrupted the young nation.
High stakes.
Yeah, so before we get into all that, what comes to mind when you think of Madison? The father of the Constitution, or a president leading during a very chaotic time.
It's interesting how those two images kind of are intertwined, especially when you think about the War of 1812.
Right.
So Madison served from 1809 to 1817, and he kind of inherited this nation that was dealing with a struggling economy and a massive debt from the Louisiana Purchase,
Oh, right.
and still tensions with Great Britain and France.
Yeah, it's easy to forget just how young the U.S. was at that time.
Yeah.
You know, they had won independence, but they were still trying to establish themselves on this world stage with all these European power struggles going on around them.
Exactly. And one of the biggest challenges Madison faced was this failure of the Jeffersonian ideal of using economic coercion to try to avoid war.
Huh.
So these embargoes they put in place that were designed to put pressure on Great Britain really backfired and ended up hurting the American economy pretty bad.
It almost seems naive in hindsight, trying to just stop trading with this global superpower and expecting them to just cave to your demands. Like, what were they thinking?
I think it's important to remember the context.
Yeah.
The Jeffersonians, including Madison, genuinely thought they could use economic power to achieve their foreign policy goals. And, they were looking back at the colonial boycotts before the Revolution.
Oh, right.
But the global situation in the early 1800s was much different.
Sure.
They were dealing with Napoleon
Oh, wow.
and a British Empire that was at the height of its naval power.
So how did that miscalculation lead to the War of 1812? Was it just a study decision, or was it more of a gradual thing?
There was a number of different factors that kind of pushed them to war.
Okay.
The British practice of impressment was a major issue, where they were seizing American sailors and forcing them into the Royal Navy.
Right.
But the failure of that economic coercion played a key role.
I see.
When the embargoes didn't work, it created this sense of frustration,
Yeah.
and then the belief that maybe military action was the only option left.
So essentially, they just kind of stumbled into a war unprepared.
Woefully unprepared.
Okay.
The U.S. military was very underfunded, the
Hmm.
leadership was questionable, and they really relied on inexperienced militia.
Oh, wow.
It's almost unbelievable. But Thomas Jefferson actually predicted that the war would only last a few weeks.
Oh my gosh. Talk about underestimating your opponent. What led him to believe that?
It speaks to a level of idealism that I think permeated a lot of the Jeffersonian thinking. They believed in the righteousness of their cause, the strength of their citizen soldiers, and they just underestimated the challenges of fighting against a major military power like Great Britain.
Sure.
And to highlight how unprepared they were,
Okay.
consider Madison's appointments for Secretary of the Navy and Secretary of War,
All right.
a man known for excessive drinking and a surgeon from the Revolutionary War.
Wow, that's shocking.
Yeah.
I can only imagine what the public outcry would be if those kinds of appointments were made today.
Oh, absolutely.
It would be a media frenzy.
For sure.
So with this less than ideal leadership and an underprepared military, the U.S. entered the War of 1812.
Yeah.
And one of the most shocking events of that war has to be the burning of Washington, D.C. The White House and the Capitol were engulfed in flames. How did that even happen?
Well, most historians agree that the burning of Washington was really an act of retaliation. Earlier in the war, American forces had actually burned buildings in York, which is now Toronto.
Uh-huh.
And so the British attack on Washington was likely payback, a clear example of how violence can escalate in warfare.
But amidst all that chaos and destruction, there's this incredible story of Dolly Madison, the First Lady,
Right.
refusing to leave the White House until she had saved a very valuable portrait of George Washington.
A national treasure.
Why was that action so significant?
Well, I think it became a symbol of defiance and resilience.
Okay.
In the face of this enemy attack, it really captured the spirit of that young nation, and they weren't willing to back down even when their capital was burning.
Right.
That image of her saving this national treasure
Yeah.
and not letting it fall into enemy hands really resonated with the public.
So in a way, it helped to kind of galvanize support for the war and solidify that image of the First Lady as this patriotic figure.
Exactly.
So the War of 1812 was far from smooth sailing for the U.S.
Huh.
They were ill-prepared, faced a lot of setbacks, and even had their capital burned. But amidst all of that, there were also glimmers of resilience and a growing sense of national identity.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
The war, despite its messy beginnings and challenges, really played a crucial role in shaping the future of the U.S.
And that leads us to a very pivotal question. Was the War of 1812 a disaster for the U.S., or were there some positive outcomes?
Good question.
We'll dig into that more later.
The War of 1812 is often described as kind of a messy chapter in American history,
Yeah,
but it's also really a pivotal one.
right.
And to understand its impact, I think we need to dig a little deeper into some of the challenges that Madison faced when he took office back in 1809.
Okay.
Um,
We talked about the Louisiana Purchase debt earlier,
yeah,
which, makes sense. They got all this
a
territory.
massive amount of territory.
Yeah, but how did that purchase clash with their whole philosophy of small government and minimal debt?
The Louisiana Purchase was a bold move, for sure.
Okay.
It more than doubled the size of the United States, but it came with a pretty hefty price tag, $15 million,
Oh, wow.
which was an astronomical sum at the time.
Right.
It far exceeded their annual budget.
Yeah. It seems like a classic case of short-term gain, long-term pain, They got this amazing land deal,
Right.
but then they were stuck with this huge financial burden.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it created this dilemma for the Jeffersonians,
Okay.
who ideologically favored limited government and fiscal restraint.
Right.
They now had to manage this vast new territory and figure out how to pay for it,
Yeah.
all while navigating the treacherous waters of European politics and their own internal divisions.
And as we talked about earlier, their solution for dealing with all that international pressure, especially from Great Britain and France, was economic coercion.
Yeah, embargoes,
Right.
restrictions on trade.
Yeah.
Those were their main tools.
Yeah. But we know that that ultimately backfired. So can you talk a little bit about why that approach was doomed to fail?
Well, the Jeffersonians really believed in the power of economic leverage.
Okay.
They looked back to the colonial era when those boycotts on British goods had forced Parliament to kind of reconsider their policies, but they failed to grasp the changing dynamics of the global stage.
Okay.
By the early 1800s, they were dealing with Napoleon Bonaparte,
Yeah.
who had ambitions of European domination,
Wow.
and a British Empire that was determined to maintain its naval supremacy, especially after their big victory at Trafalgar.
So the U.S. was kind of stuck in this power struggle between these two titans,
Exactly.
trying to assert its neutrality and its trading rights.
Yeah, and their economic coercion strategy just completely underestimated the resolve of both Britain and France.
Right.
The British were not going to risk Napoleon gaining access to all those resources from their colonies in the Western Hemisphere.
I see.
American protests and embargoes just weren't a high enough priority for them.
It really does seem like a case of idealism clashing with just the harsh realities of global power politics.
Yeah.
But beyond just those economic aspects, the British practice of impressment was a constant source of tension as well. They were seizing those American sailors and forcing them into the Royal Navy. What was their justification for that, and how did it fuel that animosity towards Great Britain?
Well, the British argued that they were simply reclaiming British deserters.
Okay.
They claimed that many American sailors were actually British subjects who had fled their obligations.
Right.
But for the Americans, it was a blatant violation of their sovereignty
Yeah.
and an attack on their national pride.
It must have been so infuriating for those sailors
Oh, absolutely.
to be out on the sea just going about your business
Yeah.
and suddenly be forced into service for this foreign power.
It created this sense of vulnerability and outrage.
Yeah.
And it really highlighted this fundamental clash between American and British perspectives on citizenship.
Okay.
At the time,
Yeah.
national allegiance was seen as this lifelong obligation in most of Europe.
Uh-huh.
That idea that individuals could choose their nationality, that was a radical idea to them.
Wow.
And it really challenged that British view.
So the War of 1812 wasn't just about trade or territory.
Right.
It was about defining what it meant to be an American.
Yeah,
And asserting their right to exist on their own terms.
exactly.
Okay.
And this brings us to the Chesapeake Leopard Affair of 1807.
Okay.
A British warship, the Leopard, attacked an American frigate, the Chesapeake, just off the coast of Virginia.
Oh, wow.
It was a very brazen act of aggression.
Yeah, this wasn't just some distant naval skirmish. This was something that people on the shore could actually see happening.
They witnessed it.
It must have been shocking for them.
It was a very visible and deeply humiliating incident for the U.S.
How did the public react, and what did President Jefferson do in response?
Well, there were calls for war,
Sure.
but Jefferson, still clinging to that hope for a peaceful resolution,
Okay.
he chose not to retaliate militarily.
But you could say that the seeds of war were sown, and by
Yeah.
1812, with all these unresolved issues just simmering,
Right.
war was finally declared.
They couldn't avoid it.
Yeah, and as we discussed, the U.S. entered this conflict woefully unprepared.
Yeah, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
Remember Jefferson's prediction about a swift victory?
Right.
The reality was much different.
They thought they could quickly invade and conquer Canada
Right.
and use that as leverage against the British.
Yeah, but their early military campaigns were disastrous.
What happened?
Well, their forces were ill-equipped,
Okay.
poorly led.
Uh-huh.
They faced seasoned British troops and their Native American allies.
Right.
The financial costs were staggering, too.
Oh, wow.
It nearly bankrupted the young nation.
It seems like those early defeats really exposed those flaws in that Jeffersonian ideal of a small, decentralized government.
Yeah, it was a harsh wake-up call for Madison.
Yeah.
He was having to confront the limits of his ideology in the face of a national crisis.
And on top of all that, he had to run for re-election in 1812.
Yeah, imagine that.
With a war going on and his own party divided over whether it was even necessary,
Right.
what were the key issues at that time, and who were his opponents?
Well, the war was the dominant issue, of course.
Of course.
The Federalist Party,
Okay.
which was already kind of in decline,
Yeah.
vehemently opposed the war.
Really?
They saw it as a reckless venture,
Huh.
driven by the Democratic Republicans.
So the war kind of reshaped the American political landscape.
It did, in a way.
Yeah.
It ushered in a period of one-party dominance for the Democratic Republicans.
Interesting.
Though it's worth noting that internal divisions within that party would eventually lead to new factions and even new party systems down the line.
Okay. So back to the battlefield.
Yeah.
How did the war progress after those initial setbacks? Were there any turning points or significant victories for the U.S.?
Despite those early struggles, there were moments of success.
Okay.
The U.S. Navy, although small,
Yeah.
scored some impressive victories,
Like what?
like the Battle of Lake Erie,
Okay.
Commodore Oliver Hazard, Perry's famous message, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours."
Oh, I've heard that one.
Yeah, we really captured the spirit of those triumphs.
It must have been such a morale boost for the nation,
Absolutely.
especially after those early defeats.
Yeah, and the death of Tecumseh,
Oh, right.
the Shawnee leader who had allied with the British,
Yeah.
the Battle of the Thames, was another significant turning point.
Why is that?
Well, it weakened that British Native American alliance
Okay.
and had a lasting impact on the future of both the United States and Canada.
But even with those victories, the war dragged on.
Right.
And in 1814, the British launched that daring attack that really shocked the nation.
Yeah, the burning of Washington, D.C.
It was such a humiliating defeat
For sure.
and a stark reminder of that young nation's vulnerability.
It was a devastating blow, both physically and symbolically.
Yeah.
But as we discussed, it also became this rallying point.
Okay.
That image of Dolly Madison saving that portrait of George Washington
Right.
really resonated with the public
Yeah.
and fueled this surge of patriotism and defiance.
So the burning of Washington, while a setback, ultimately strengthened the resolve of the American people.
Yeah, I think you could say that.
So in the end, did the War of 1812 actually achieve anything lasting for the U.S.?
That's a complex question.
Okay.
It's a war that often gets overshadowed by the Revolution and the Civil War,
Right.
but its consequences were profound.
Okay. I'm interested to hear more. So we've talked about the causes and the key events of the War of 1812, but what about the aftermath? You mentioned it had some profound consequences.
Yeah, it did.
Did the U.S. ultimately achieve its objectives, or was it all for nothing?
Well, the War of 1812 is often called the Forgotten War.
Right.
Sandwiched between the Revolution and the Civil War.
Yeah, overshadowed.
But its legacy is more complex than just simple victory or defeat.
The Treaty of Ghent, which was signed in December of 1814, basically restored everything back to how it was before the war, right?
Essentially, yes.
No territory changed hands, and a lot of the issues that led to the conflict, like impressment, weren't even addressed.
That's true.
Mm.
On the surface, it does seem like they fought this really costly war and ended up right back where they started.
Yeah.
But when you look deeper, you see that it had this huge impact on American identity politics and foreign relations.
Okay, so how did it shape the way Americans viewed themselves and their place in the world?
Well, the War of 1812, despite its stumbles, really proved that this young nation could stand up to a global superpower like Great Britain.
Yeah.
It really fostered a sense of national unity and pride.
Okay.
They had weathered the storm, defended their land, and emerged in a sense, more confident on the world stage.
It's interesting how a war that didn't have any clear territorial gains or decisive victories
Right.
could still have such a profound effect on national identity.
Well, I think it speaks to that psychological impact of the war.
Okay.
You know, it was a crucible that really forged a stronger sense of nationhood,
Yeah.
that shared experience of fighting a common enemy, even with all those setbacks,
Right.
really helped to solidify that sense of American identity and purpose.
And what about the political landscape? We talked about the demise of the Federalist Party.
All right.
How did the war contribute to that, and what were the long-term consequences?
The Federalists' opposition to the war, especially in New England,
Oi.
made them look unpatriotic,
Yeah.
out of touch with how everyone else was feeling.
Right.
Their association with the Hartford Convention, where some of them discussed secession,
Oh, wow.
further damaged their reputation.
So the war essentially eliminated one of the major political parties.
It did,
Yeah.
and it paved the way for that era of good feelings
Oh, right.
and the rise of a new generation of leaders.
And beyond the U.S. itself, what about its relationship with Great Britain and Canada?
Well, the War of 1812 really marked a turning point in Anglo-American relations.
Okay.
It began in conflict, but ultimately it laid the foundation for a century of relative peace and cooperation.
Wow.
That shared border that was once a point of so much tension
Right.
became the longest undefended border in the world.
It's amazing how they went from burning each other's capitals to having an undefended border.
It is. It really speaks volumes about that potential for reconciliation and cooperation, even after such a bitter conflict.
And the war had a big impact on the development of Canada too, right?
Definitely.
That experience of resisting that American invasion really helped to foster a sense of Canadian identity
Exactly.
and solidify their connection with Great Britain.
It's a good reminder that the consequences of war often extend far beyond those who are directly involved,
Yeah.
and they can really shape the destinies of entire nations.
And finally, we can't forget about the impact on James Madison himself.
Right.
You know, he started his presidency as a strong advocate for limited government.
Yeah, very much influenced by those Jeffersonian ideals.
But the war really forced him to confront the limitations of those beliefs.
It did.
We touched on his changing views on federal power.
Yeah.
You know, he eventually embraced policies like the Second Bank of the United States that he'd opposed before.
It shows a real capacity for growth and pragmatism.
Yeah.
You know, Madison was willing to learn from his experiences and adjust his views based on the realities he was facing.
So it seems like he was putting the nation's needs above his own personal ideology.
I think that's a fair assessment.
So the War of 1812, though often overlooked or misunderstood, played this crucial role in shaping the United States, its identity, its politics, and its place in the world.
It did. It solidified national unity, forced a reevaluation of the balance between federal and state power, and set the stage for a new era in Anglo-American relations.
It reminds us that history is rarely neat or simple.
No, it's not.
Wars that seem to end in a stalemate can have all these far-reaching consequences that continue to shape the world we live in today.
Exactly.
Well, we've explored the historical context, the key events, and the lasting legacy of the War of 1812. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into this pivotal period in American history.